This meeting is being recorded.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much and welcome all to another Juris North monthly discussion. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Ronagh McQuigg, who is a senior lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast. And she was part of our roundtables last term when we were discussing sustainability issues, in particular this time gender issues. And we're going to talk about her paper, her latest paper, if I'm right, Ronagh, responding to the global crisis of domestic violence. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and you have the floor. And after that, I'll stop the recording. However, we will have Dr. Kay Lalor, one of my colleagues, reader at Manchester Law School. She will be our discussant. So thank you, Ronagh, and thank you very much, Kay. Ronagh, your floor.
Thank you very much indeed. Hi, and thank you for the very kind invitation to speak at this event. And many thanks also to Kay for agreeing to act as discussant. So, as Horia said, the topic of my paper is responding to the global crisis of domestic violence. So domestic violence affects vast numbers of people throughout all nations of the world, and it is now well recognised as constituting a health issue. However, since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, incidents of domestic abuse have increased dramatically around the world. The lockdown measures, which were adopted by many states, including the UK, although necessary to limit the spread of the virus, nevertheless themselves were highly detrimental to the health of individuals, for example, in terms of the impact on mental health. In particular, those already living in abusive relationships found themselves to be even more isolated and trapped in such situations, given the lockdown and social distancing measures which were imposed. And in addition, the widespread anxiety created by the pandemic in terms of health concerns and also financial worries increased tensions within many relationships, all too often resulting in violence. And the increase in rates of domestic abuse has been so marked that UN Women has termed violence against women during the pandemic as being the shadow pandemic. However, there is a danger of viewing this issue as simply being caused by the pandemic. In reality, the pandemic served to expose and exacerbate pre-existing difficulties with the responses of states to this issue. So this paper then will examine the increase in rates of domestic abuse since the beginning of the pandemic, and will focus on the responses of UN human rights entities, such as the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, UN Women, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And the paper will discuss the recommendations which have been made by such entities regarding the measures which should be adopted by governments to address domestic abuse in the context of the pandemic and in a post-pandemic world. So studies carried out have shown that since the beginning of the pandemic, rates of domestic abuse have increased considerably around the world. Of course, domestic abuse is caused by the actions of individual perpetrators, and the existence of the pandemic must in no way be seen to negate the responsibility of such perpetrators for their actions. However, the measures which were adopted by governments did have the impact of exacerbating the suffering of those experiencing domestic abuse. The nature of such abuse is that it occurs behind closed doors, and in April 2020, around half of the world's population were in lockdown. And measures mandating that people should only leave their homes for essential purposes and severely limiting social contact meant that many victims of domestic abuse were essentially trapped with their abusers with very little means of escape. And in such circumstances, even the simple act of phoning or texting a friend for support, or indeed phoning a specialist support service, becomes more difficult or even impossible if both the victim and the perpetrator are at home together for almost all of the time. The situation was further exacerbated for victims who, due to pre-existing health conditions, were shielding from the virus and who could therefore not leave their homes at all. Indeed, such victims may have been in the position of being heavily reliant on their abusers in terms of purchasing food and collecting medication. It is common for perpetrators of domestic abuse to attempt to isolate victims by cutting them off from friends and family. And with lockdown and social distancing measures, that was automatically effected without any effort on the part of perpetrators. So just in relation to some statistics, according to a survey carried out by Women's Aid in April 2020, 67% of those who currently experienced abuse said that it had gotten worse since the onset of the pandemic, and 76% said that they were having to spend more time with their abuser. 71% said that their abuser had a greater level of control over their life since the beginning of the pandemic, and 78% said that the pandemic had made it more difficult for them to leave their abuser. In another survey that was carried out by Women's Aid in June 2020, 91% of those experiencing abuse said that the pandemic had affected their experience of abuse in one or more ways. For example, feeling more afraid, feeling that they had no one to turn to, being reluctant to go to friends or family for fear of spreading the virus. Also, 30% of those experiencing domestic abuse said that their abuser blamed them for the economic impact of the pandemic on the household. And of course, the situation was further exacerbated by the fact that at the very time of rising rates of domestic abuse, services available to victims were reduced, again due to lockdown and social distancing measures. So in effect, services were reduced at the time when they were most needed. And according to a survey again carried out by Women's Aid service providers, 84% said that they had to reduce or cancel one or more services. So how did the human rights bodies respond to these concerns? Well, just before discussing the responses of the UN human rights bodies to the increase of domestic abuse during the pandemic, just to talk very briefly about domestic abuse as an issue for international human rights law more generally, as it is only relatively recently that domestic abuse began to be regarded as an issue for international human rights law. The main problem with including domestic abuse within international human rights law to begin with was found in the way in which the rights themselves were formulated. Essentially, international law has its basis in the liberal social contract theory, whereby states are viewed as individuals which should have equality, independence and freedom. And inherent to that theory is the concept of negative rights ensuring individual freedom. And that idea is therefore embedded deeply in the discourse of international law and subsequently human rights law. And essentially the concept of negative rights meant that the state cannot interfere with an individual in certain aspects of his or her life. And another main principle of international law is that in general, it's only states that can be subject to this body of law. So human rights therefore evolved to protect the rights of the individual from encroachment by the state. And the rights norms which emerged were generally formulated in a negative way, whereby the state was obliged only to refrain from breaching the rights in question. There were no duties on the state to adopt positive measures to ensure that the rights of the individual were not violated. And in addition, the state was not obliged to protect the rights of the individual from violation by another private party. So rights therefore developed in such a way as to create a public-private divide by which human rights norms were upheld in the public sphere where the state was involved, but were not applied in the private sphere. However, of course, the public-private divide does not now pose an insurmountable problem as regards the recognition of domestic abuse as an issue for human rights law. Various ways have been developed in which human rights may now enter the private sphere. In particular, the concept of state responsibility has been developed, under which positive obligations can be placed directly on the state to ensure that human rights standards are upheld in situations involving only private individuals. And at the regional level, the judicial branches of both the Inter-American and the Council of Europe systems have been extremely instrumental in developing the concepts of state responsibility and positive obligations. So none of the UN human rights treaties make any express reference to domestic abuse. However, the UN human rights bodies have now brought the issue of domestic abuse within their scope through the use of provisions such as the right to life, the right not to be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to equality, the right to liberty and security of the person, the right to equal protection under the law, and so on. Various categories of recommendations have been made to states as regards their responses to domestic abuse. These include the adoption of measures relating to improving criminal justice systems, improving civil law protection measures, providing social support measures, raising awareness within society as a whole, and so on. Instruments that are relevant to the issue of domestic abuse include the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, resolutions of the UN General Assembly, and reports of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Of those instruments, in strict legal terms, only CEDAW is legally binding on states. However, it is important to note that that treaty does not contain any express reference to domestic abuse, but it has been interpreted by the CEDAW committee in such a way as to encompass this issue. Of course, the recognition of domestic abuse is not, as a human rights issue, is not confined to the UN bodies. For example, within the Council of Europe, there is now, of course, the Istanbul Convention on violence against women in the European context. And there is also the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment and Eradication of Violence Against Women, and the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa. So, all of that being said, what has been the responses of the UN agencies to the increase in domestic abuse since the beginning of the pandemic? Well, back in March 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women issued a statement on domestic abuse in the context of COVID-19 lockdowns. And in that statement, she commented that for too many women and children, home can be a place of fear and abuse. That situation worsens considerably in cases of isolation, such as the lockdowns imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And she went on to say that all states should make significant efforts to address the COVID-19 threat, but they should not leave behind women and children victims of domestic violence, as this could lead to an increase of domestic violence, including intimate partner femicides. The Special Rapporteur called upon governments not to put the protection of victims on hold, and proceeded to state that measures to protect victims must remain available or be adopted during the crisis, and that included ensuring that victims had access to protection orders such as restraining orders, also shelter availability and helplines. The UN Secretary General, again in April 2020, called for measures to address what he termed a horrifying global surge in domestic violence connected to lockdowns that were imposed. And he pointed out that for many, the threat looms largest where they should be safest, in their own homes. And he proceeded to make a number of recommendations to states, including increasing investment in online services, declaring shelters as essential services, creating safe ways for victims to seek support without alerting their abusers, avoiding the release of prisoners convicted of violence against women, and scaling up public awareness campaigns. The CEDAW committee issued a guidance note on CEDAW on COVID-19, in which it stated that during confinement, women and girls are at increased risk of domestic, sexual, economic, psychological and other forms of gender-based violence by abusive partners. States parties have a due diligence obligation to prevent and protect women from and hold perpetrators accountable for gender-based violence against women. And they should ensure that women and girls who are victims or at risk of gender-based violence have effective access to justice, particularly to protection orders, medical and psychosocial assistance, shelters and rehabilitation programs. UN Women also made a range of recommendations to government and civil society organisations, such as allocating additional resources to addressing violence against women, and again treating services for women who have experienced violence as being essential, expanding the capacity of shelters, strengthening helplines and online counselling, and increasing support for grassroots organisations, particularly those that provide essential services for hard to reach, remote or vulnerable populations. So a wide range of recommendations were made to states in terms of how they should respond to the increase in domestic abuse during the pandemic. However, it is largely, it is very likely that even if all of those recommendations had been adopted by all states, the increase in rates of domestic abuse would not have been avoided. So therefore, we need to look to the future. And the COVID pandemic is undoubtedly an unprecedented situation which has caused intractable problems for governments worldwide. Until such times as vaccines were freely available in all states at the global level, the most effective way of preventing the spread of a contagious virus was to keep people apart as much as possible. And that, of course, was the premise behind the lockdown and social distancing measures which were imposed. For the majority, home was the safest place during the pandemic. However, the paradox for those experiencing domestic abuse was that it was conversely the most dangerous place to be in relation to the shadow pandemic of domestic abuse. And although COVID-19 vaccines were rolled out relatively rapidly in states such as the UK, it must be remembered that there are many states around the world in which access to such vaccines is still very limited. And so the recommendations made by entities such as the UN bodies in terms of the mitigations which should be put in place to protect victims of domestic abuse are therefore still very relevant. Again, it must be emphasised that domestic abuse is caused by the behaviour of perpetrators, and lockdown measures cannot negate the responsibility of such perpetrators for their actions. However, the social distancing and lockdown measures did create conditions which served to facilitate the occurrence of domestic abuse. And that was a problem to which there were no easy solutions. As I mentioned, although the human rights body certainly put forward a number of very meritorious recommendations, even if these had all been implemented, it is still unlikely that the impact of lockdown and distancing measures on rates of domestic abuse would be entirely negated. The COVID-19 pandemic is a health issue in ways which go beyond cases of the virus itself. And it is likely to remain so until such times as vaccines are freely available in all states at the global level. However, there are also longer-term lessons which can be learned from the pandemic. As was commented by the UN in April 2020, the pandemic is deepening pre-existing inequalities, exposing vulnerabilities in social, political and economic systems, which are in turn amplifying the impacts of the pandemic. And that statement is very pertinent to the issue of domestic abuse. As noted by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in her October 2020 report, the pandemic has exposed pre-existing gaps and shortcomings in the prevention of violence against women as a human rights violation that have not been sufficiently addressed by many states even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a danger of viewing the current problems regarding responses to domestic abuse as simply being caused by the measures adopted by states in relation to COVID-19. However, in reality, the pandemic has served to expose and exacerbate pre-existing difficulties with the responses of states to domestic abuse. For example, as was noted by the Special Rapporteur, in many states the helplines for victims of domestic abuse were not available around the clock. And that problem was then brought into sharp relief during the pandemic, as many helplines experienced an increased volume of calls, thus placing greater pressure on services which may have been insufficient in the first place, and highlighting the need for improved provision of such services. Again, as noted by the Special Rapporteur, prior to the pandemic, many shelters had limited capacity and were under-resourced. And so again, the surge in cases of domestic abuse during the pandemic served to place even greater pressure on already inadequate service provision. The fact that the COVID-19 pandemic has raised awareness of the shortcomings of state responses to domestic abuse may contribute towards an improvement in such responses in the future. And it is certainly the case that the increase in rates of domestic abuse during the pandemic has been widely covered by the media, thus raising public awareness of the issues involved. Likewise, the pandemic has brought into focus the benefits and indeed necessity of working together to achieve common goals at both the international and national levels. Again, this is a lesson which is applicable in the context of addressing domestic abuse. There has been some evidence of such solidarity between states in terms of resolving to address the issue of domestic abuse. For example, in May 2020, the governments of 59 states issued a joint press statement asserting that the restrictive measures designed to limit the spread of the virus around the world increase the risk of domestic violence, including intimate partner violence, as health and social protection, as well as legal systems that protect all women and girls under normal circumstances are weakened or under pressure by COVID-19. Specific measures should be implemented to prevent violence against women and girls. And so the challenge then for all states must now be to act on the lessons of the shadow pandemic and work towards a common goal of combating domestic abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronagh. And I'm going now to give the floor to Dr. Lalor. But before doing that, I'm going to stop the recording. Just give me a second.